The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, broadcast on every frequency humans had ever discovered, and several they had not. It came from beyond the edge of the solar system, from a ship so massive that when telescopes finally captured its image, scientists wept at the sheer impossibility of its construction. The vessel, stretched longer than Earth's moon, was wide, its surface covered in patterns that seemed to shift and change, even as observers watched. The translation came quickly, almost too quickly, as if the senders had studied humanity for years before making contact. The message was simple, delivered in every human language simultaneously, and it contained no greeting, no offer of friendship, no request for communication. It was a statement, cold and final, delivered with the certainty of beings who had watched civilizations rise and fall across the galaxy for millions of years. Species designation: human. Origin: third planet, yellow star system, outer spiral arm. Biological classification: carbon-based, oxygen-dependent, limited neural capacity. Technological development: pre-interstellar, early atomic age. Social structure: fragmented, tribal, aggressive. Survival probability: 0. Estimated time until extinction: 6 standard galactic months. This message serves as official notification. Your system has been marked for future colonization following the natural conclusion of your species' existence. No intervention will be offered. No assistance will be provided. This is not a punishment. This is simply the way of things. You are not the first. You will not be the last. The world went mad for exactly 3 days. Governments held emergency sessions. Religious leaders declared the end times had arrived. Scientists argued about whether the message was genuine or an elaborate hoax. Stock markets crashed. People rioted in some cities and prayed in others. Suicide rates spiked. Birth rates would later show a curious increase as well, as if some primal part of humanity had decided to fight back in the only way biology knew how. On the 4th day, something strange happened. A factory worker in Detroit named Marcus Williams showed up for his shift. When asked why he had come to work when the world was ending, he shrugged and said, "Aliens are no aliens. My kids still need to eat." His words spread across the internet, shared millions of times within hours. By the end of the week, most of the world had returned to something resembling normal. People went back to work. Children went back to school. The message from the stars became just another thing to worry about, like climate change, or nuclear war, or the economy. The aliens had not accounted for this. They had not understood that humanity had been predicting its own end for as long as it had existed. Every generation believed it would be the last. Every century brought new prophecies of doom. Humans had become experts at living under the shadow of extinction. They had practice. 6 months passed. Nothing happened. The alien ship remained at the edge of the solar system, silent and watchful. Scientists calculated that based on its deceleration pattern, it had been traveling for at least 10,000 years before arriving. Whatever intelligence had sent the message was operating on timescales that made human history look like the blink of an eye. Perhaps their definition of 6 months was different. Perhaps they were simply wrong. A year after the message, a young physicist named Dr. Sarah Chen published a paper that would change everything. She had been studying the alien transmission, not its content, but its carrier wave, the method by which it had been broadcast. What she found was a mathematical pattern embedded within the signal itself, a pattern that described the fundamental structure of space-time in ways human physics had never imagined. They had sent a gift, whether they intended to or not. Within 5 years, humanity had developed its first faster-than-light drive. The technology was crude by galactic standards, barely capable of reaching the nearest stars within a human lifetime. But it worked. For the first time in history, humans could leave their solar system. The first expedition launched with a crew of 12, volunteers who knew they might never return. Their mission was simple: find the aliens who had predicted humanity's end, and ask them why they had been wrong. The crew of the Defiance, as they had named their ship, travelled for 3 years before they found their answer. In a system 4 light-years from Earth, orbiting a red dwarf star, they discovered a dead world. The planet had once been home to a thriving civilization, its surface covered in the ruins of cities that had stood for millions of years. The architecture matched the patterns on the alien ship still watching Earth. This had been their home. This had been where they came from. The ruins told a story that the crew pieced together over months of exploration. The aliens had called themselves the Watchers. They had achieved faster-than-light travel millions of years before humans had learned to make fire. They had spread across the galaxy, cataloguing every world, every species, every spark of intelligence they encountered, and they had developed a science of prediction so advanced that they could calculate the fate of civilizations with mathematical precision. They had been right almost every time. Species after species had risen and fallen exactly as the Watchers predicted. Worlds had burned and frozen and torn themselves apart on schedules the Watchers could calculate to the day. They had watched the galaxy for so long that they had stopped seeing possibility. They had started seeing only inevitability. But the Watchers themselves had made an error. Somewhere in their calculations, they had failed to account for a variable they did not possess, the capacity to be wrong and learn from it. They had grown so certain of their predictions that when those predictions began to fail, they could not adapt. Their civilization had collapsed not from external threats, but from internal rigidity. They had become so focused on watching that they had forgotten how to live. The crew of the Defiance returned to Earth with this knowledge, and with something else. In the ruins they had found the Watchers' database, a repository of information about every species the ancient aliens had ever encountered. Among those records were thousands of civilizations the Watchers had predicted would fail, but had not yet been confirmed. Worlds full of beings who might have survived, just as humanity had survived. Earth's governments, united for the first time in human history by the common purpose of exploration, began sending expeditions to those worlds. Some found nothing but dust and bones, civilizations that had indeed fallen as predicted, but others found life. They found species that had beaten the odds, that had refused to die, that had looked at the certainty of their extinction and said no. 50 years after the original message, humanity made contact with its first living alien civilization. They called themselves the Broken, because the Watchers had predicted their destruction through a great war that would shatter their world. The war had come exactly as predicted. Their world had shattered, exactly as predicted. But the Broken had survived by fleeing underground, by adapting, by refusing to accept that shattered meant destroyed. The meeting between humans and the Broken was awkward and beautiful and terrifying all at once. Neither species had ever encountered another intelligent race that was still alive. Both had only known the Watchers and the long shadow of their predictions. When a human diplomat extended her hand to a Broken ambassador, and the ambassador reached out with a limb that was not a hand but served the same purpose, something fundamental changed in the galaxy. The Survivors' Alliance, as it came to be called, began with 2 species and grew with each passing decade. Every world the Watchers had marked for death became a potential member. Some had fallen, yes, but many had not. The Watchers' predictions, it turned out, had a fatal flaw. They were based on the assumption that species, once catalogued, would continue on their predicted paths. They did not account for the possibility that knowledge of the prediction itself would change the outcome. 100 years after the message, the Survivors' Alliance numbered 17 species. Each one had a story of defiance. The crystalline had been predicted to die when their sun expanded, so they had built ships and moved their entire civilization to a new system. The swimmers had been predicted to be wiped out by a disease, so they had developed medical technology that cured not just that disease, but all disease. The builders had been predicted to destroy themselves with war, so they had invented a new form of government. And humanity? Humanity had been predicted to destroy itself through its own aggression and short-sightedness. Instead, humans had taken those very traits and turned them into tools for survival. Their aggression became determination. Their short-sightedness became adaptability. Every flaw the Watchers had seen as a death sentence, humans had transformed into a strength. The alien ship still waited at the edge of the solar system. It had not moved in a century. scientists eventually realized why. It was automated. The Watchers who had built it were long dead. The ship was simply following its programming, waiting for the predicted extinction to occur, waiting to signal that Earth was ready for colonization. It would wait forever if necessary. It did not know how to do anything else. 200 years after the message, humans finally boarded the alien ship. They found no crew, no life, nothing but machines that had been running on automatic for 10,000 years. The ship's computers contained records of every prediction the Watchers had ever made, every world they had marked for death. The database listed over 1 million species. Of those, the Watchers had confirmed the extinction of 900,000. That left 100,000 predictions still unverified. The Survivors Alliance made a decision. They would visit every one of those worlds. They would find everyone who had survived. They would build something the Watchers never imagined possible, a civilization of the impossible, a federation of species who should not exist, a coalition of those who had refused to die. It took 500 years. At the end of that time, the Survivors Alliance had found 62,000 species still alive. 62,000 civilizations that had looked at the certainty of their extinction and chosen to live anyway. Some had barely survived, reduced to small populations on ravaged worlds. Others had thrived, building empires that spanned dozens of star systems. All of them had one thing in common. They had been told they would die. And they had decided that the universe was wrong. The Watchers' database had contained one more piece of information, a set of coordinates for a location at the center of the galaxy. The records indicated that this was the Watchers' true home, the place where they had originated before spreading across the stars. For 500 years, no one had gone there. The Survivors Alliance had been too busy finding its members, building its connections, learning to work together. But now, with 62,000 species united, they finally had the resources to mount an expedition to the galactic core. What they found there changed everything again. The Watchers were not extinct. They had simply evolved. At the center of the galaxy, protected by a shell of artificial constructs that blocked all light and radiation, the Watchers had built a new home. They had not died when their civilization collapsed. They had retreated, turned inward, focused all their attention on a single goal, understanding where their predictions had gone wrong. For millions of years, they had studied their failures, analyzed every species that had survived, tried to find the variable they had missed, and they had found it. The variable was hope. The Watchers had never understood hope because they had never needed it. Their predictions had been so accurate for so long that they had stopped imagining alternatives. They had seen the future as a fixed point, a destination that could not be changed. But the species that survived, the ones who defied the predictions, they had something the Watchers lacked. They had the ability to believe in a future that did not exist, to work toward an outcome that all evidence suggested was impossible, to hope. When the Survivors Alliance fleet arrived at the galactic core, the Watchers were waiting for them, not with weapons, not with warnings, but with a question. They wanted to know how it felt. They wanted to know what hope was like. They had spent millions of years trying to understand it intellectually, but they had never experienced it themselves. They had never had to. They had never faced a future they did not know. The meeting between the Survivors Alliance and the Watchers was not a confrontation. It was a conversation that lasted for years. Both sides had something to teach and something to learn. The Watchers shared their knowledge of the galaxy, their understanding of physics and biology, and the fundamental nature of reality. The survivors shared their experience of uncertainty, their ability to face the unknown without despair. 1,000 years after the original message, the galaxy had transformed. The Watchers emerged from their isolation at the galactic core. They joined the Survivors Alliance, not as leaders, but as members. They shared their technology, their knowledge, their millions of years of accumulated wisdom. In return, they asked for something they could not build themselves: stories of survival. Every species that had defied their predictions was invited to share its history, its struggles, its triumphs. The Watchers listened to them all, trying to understand the thing they had missed, trying to learn hope. Humanity played a special role in this new galaxy. They had been the first to survive a Watcher prediction, after the Watchers had retreated to the galactic core. They had been the ones to find the broken, to form the Survivors Alliance, to transform the galaxy from a graveyard into a community. Other species had survived, yes, but humans had done more than survive. They had reached out, they had connected, they had built. The original message still existed, archived in museums and databases across the galaxy. It had become a symbol not of doom, but of defiance. Estimated time until extinction, 6 standard galactic months. Those words were now carved into monuments on 1,000 worlds, a reminder of how wrong certainty could be. Every species that had survived had its own version of the message, its own prediction of death that had not come true. Together they formed a record of impossibility, a library of miracles. Some beings asked why the Watchers had sent the messages in the first place. If they had simply observed without interfering, perhaps their predictions would have come true. Perhaps telling species they would die had given them the motivation to survive. The Watchers themselves debated this question. They had not intended to help. They had intended only to inform, but the information itself had changed. The outcome. By predicting death, they had made survival possible. This was the greatest lesson of the first millennium. The future is not fixed. It never has been. Even the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy had made the mistake of believing they could see what would come. But the future is not a destination. It is a choice. It is 1,000,000 billion trillion choices made by every being who ever lived, each one changing the course of history in ways too small to measure and too large to ignore. The humans who had received that first message were long dead by the time the galaxy understood this truth. Marcus Williams, the factory worker who had shown up for his shift the day after the announcement, had died of old age surrounded by his grandchildren. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had decoded the mathematics hidden in the alien transmission, had lived long enough to see the first colonies established on other worlds. The crew of the Defiance had been celebrated as heroes, their names given to stars and planets and the children of generations yet unborn. But their legacy lived on. Every human alive 1,000 years later carried a piece of that defiance within them. They were the descendants of people who had looked at the certainty of extinction and refused to accept it. That refusal had shaped their culture, their philosophy, their very identity as a species. Humans were the ones who said no. Humans were the ones who survived. And they were not alone. 62,000 species, each with their own story of impossible survival, now filled the galaxy with life. The Watchers had predicted a universe of death, a cosmos where intelligence flickered briefly and then went dark. Instead, they had accidentally created a universe of connection, a galaxy where survivors found each other and built something greater than any single species could achieve. The message that had predicted humanity's end in 6 months had become the beginning of everything. The galaxy had known peace for 3,000 years when the silence came. It began at the outer edges, in systems so far from the galactic core that light took centuries to reach them. Colonies stopped responding to communications. Ships sent to investigate never returned. At first, the Survivors Alliance believed it was a technical problem, some kind of interference that disrupted their communication networks. They had faced such challenges before. The galaxy was vast and full of phenomena that even the Watchers did not fully understand. But then the refugees started arriving. They came in ships damaged beyond recognition, vessels that had barely survived journeys of decades. The survivors on board spoke of something they could not explain, something that had come from the void between galaxies, from the empty space where nothing was supposed to exist. They called it the silence, because that was what it left behind. Worlds it touched went quiet, not destroyed, not burned, not broken. Just silent, empty, as if every living thing had simply stopped existing. The Survivors Alliance mobilized for the first time since its founding the combined might of 62,000 species prepared for war. Fleets gathered at strategic points throughout the galaxy. The Watchers, with their millions of years of knowledge, analyzed every piece of data the refugees had brought. They ran simulations. They made predictions, and for the first time in their long history, they hoped those predictions were wrong. The enemy they faced was not a species. It was not a civilization. It was something older than the galaxy itself, something that had been waiting in the darkness between stars since before the first planet formed. The Watchers had records of it, buried deep in their archives, records they had believed were myths passed down from whatever beings had existed before their own evolution. They called it the entropy, because that was what it brought. Not death, not destruction, but an ending, a final silence from which nothing returned. The first battle lasted 6 hours and cost the lives of 10 million beings from 100 different species. The entropy did not fight like any enemy the Survivors Alliance had faced. It did not use weapons. It did not need them. Wherever it touched, existence simply stopped. Ships vanished. Planets went dark. Stars continued to burn, but everything around them became empty, scrubbed clean of life and meaning. Humanity had sent 50,000 ships to that first battle. 12,000 returned. Among the survivors was Admiral James Okonkwo, a descendant of Nigerian farmers who had emigrated to Mars 3,000 years earlier. His flagship, the Unbroken Promise, had been at the center of the battle. He had watched as ships around him simply disappeared, pulled into something that his senses could not identify and his mind could not comprehend. He had ordered a retreat when it became clear that they could not win, that they could not even understand what they were fighting. The galaxy had not known fear for 3,000 years. Now it remembered. Emergency sessions were held on 1,000 worlds. The Survivors Alliance debated strategies, argued about resources, struggled to understand an enemy that seemed beyond understanding. Some species wanted to flee, to abandon the galaxy entirely and search for safety in other realms of space. Others wanted to fight, to throw everything they had at the entropy until either they or it ceased to exist. Most simply did not know what to do. The Watchers provided what analysis they could. The entropy was not a natural phenomenon. It was something that had been created, designed, built by beings so ancient that even the Watchers' oldest records did not contain their names. These creators had vanished long before the first stars in this galaxy had formed. All that remained of them was the entropy, their final creation, their lasting legacy. Why had they built it? The Watchers did not know. Perhaps it was a weapon that had outlived its war. Perhaps it was a tool for some purpose no longer remembered. Perhaps it was simply a mistake, an experiment that had grown beyond control. Whatever its origin, its purpose now seemed clear: to end everything, to bring the universe back to the silence that had existed before existence began. This information should have brought despair. Instead, it brought something unexpected: understanding. The entropy was not invincible. It had been created. Things that were created could be understood. Things that could be understood could be countered. It would take time, resources, and sacrifices beyond imagining, but it was possible. Survival was possible. Humanity took the lead in this new war, not because they were the strongest or the wisest, but because they were the most stubborn. They had been refusing to die for 10,000 years. They were not about to stop now. Human scientists worked alongside Watcher analysts and researchers from every surviving species to find the entropy's weakness. Human admirals coordinated fleets from across the galaxy, learning to fight an enemy that could not be fought by any conventional means. Human diplomats held the Survivors Alliance together when fear threatened to tear it apart. 300 years passed. The entropy advanced slowly, patiently, as if it knew that time was on its side. Worlds fell into silence. Species that had survived the Watchers' predictions for millions of years finally met the end they had been promised. The galaxy grew smaller, the areas of light and life shrinking year by year as the darkness spread. But humanity and its allies did not surrender. They learned that the entropy could not touch certain kinds of matter, substances that had been altered at the quantum level in specific ways. They built defenses that could slow its advance. They developed weapons that could push it back, at least temporarily. They found ways to survive that no one had imagined possible. The key breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A human child named Yuki Tanaka only 12 years old, was visiting a research station near the front lines with her parents, both scientists. She was not supposed to be there, but the evacuation had happened too quickly, and there had been no time to send her somewhere safe. When the entropy touched the station, Yuki was in a laboratory filled with experimental equipment. Everyone else on the station vanished into the silence. Yuki did not. The scientists who found her days later could not explain why she had survived. The entropy had swept through the station, leaving nothing behind but empty rooms and cold machines. But Yuki had been protected by something, shielded by forces that even the Watchers could not fully analyze. The equipment in the laboratory had interacted with the entropy in ways no one had predicted, creating a bubble of existence that the silence could not touch. It took 50 years to understand what had happened, and another 100 to replicate it. The answer lay in the nature of existence itself, in the fundamental structure of reality that the Watchers had begun to map millions of years ago. The entropy worked by unraveling that structure, by pulling apart the threads that held existence together. But those threads could be reinforced, they could be strengthened, they could be woven so tightly that not even the entropy could undo them. The technology that emerged from this discovery was called the weave. It was not a weapon, not exactly. It was a way of existing more firmly, of anchoring reality so strongly that the silence could not claim it. Ships equipped with weave generators could enter areas touched by the entropy and survive. Worlds surrounded by weave barriers could resist the darkness indefinitely. For the first time since the war began, the Survivors Alliance had a way to fight back. Admiral Okonkwo, now ancient beyond the natural lifespan of any unmodified human, but kept alive by technology shared across 60 surviving species, led the first counteroffensive. His fleet of 10,000 ships, each one woven into the fabric of reality itself, pushed into territory that had been silent for centuries. What they found there changed everything. The entropy was not empty, it was full. Within the silence, preserved somehow, were the echoes of everyone who had been taken. Not alive, not exactly, but not gone either. They existed in a state between being and unbeing, caught in the moment of their ending but never quite reaching it. Billions of beings from thousands of species, suspended in a darkness that had no time and no space, waiting for something they could not name. The Survivors Alliance had spent 500 years learning to fight the entropy. Now they began to learn how to rescue those it had taken. The process was agonizingly slow. Each being had to be individually extracted from the silence, pulled back into existence, one thread at a time. The technology required was beyond anything the galaxy had ever developed. It pushed the limits of what the weave could do, what the Watcher's science could understand, what any mind could imagine. But it worked. Being by being, world by world, the victims of the entropy began to return. Yuki Tanaka, now an old woman, was among those leading the effort. The child who had survived when no one else had become a scientist dedicated to saving others. She had spent her entire life studying the silence, understanding it, learning its secrets. Now she used that knowledge to bring people home. Every being she rescued felt like a victory, a declaration that the universe would not end in silence. The entropy itself seemed to recognize the threat. It began to move faster, to spread more aggressively, as if trying to claim as many victims as possible before it could be stopped. The war entered a new phase, a race between the darkness and the light. The Survivors Alliance worked to rescue those already taken, while simultaneously trying to prevent more from being lost. 800 years after the first battle, the front lines had stabilized. The entropy had consumed merely a third of the galaxy, but its advance had slowed almost to a stop. Weave barriers protected the remaining worlds. Rescue operations continued in the silence, bringing back more survivors every day. The galaxy had been wounded, scarred, changed forever, but it was still alive, and then the entropy spoke. The message came not through any technology, but through the weave itself, transmitted along the threads that connected all existence. It was not words exactly, not in any language that any species had ever developed. It was something deeper, a communication that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to meaning. The entropy was not a weapon. It was not a punishment. It was not even a mistake. It was a question. The beings who had created it, so long ago that even time had forgotten them, had faced the ultimate problem of existence. They had achieved everything that any species could achieve. They had mastered matter and energy, space and time, life and death. They had conquered every challenge the universe could offer, and they had found themselves facing a question they could not answer. What comes next? They had looked at the universe they had conquered and seen nothing ahead but endless repetition. They had done everything. There was nothing left to do. Their existence had become meaningless, a never-ending loop of achievements that no longer mattered because there was no one left to share them with, no challenge left to make them feel alive. So they had created the entropy, not to destroy the universe, but to pose a question to whoever came after them. Could existence continue to have meaning? Could beings who faced the end find a reason to keep going? Could the universe produce something that could survive not just physical destruction, but the deeper destruction of purposelessness? The entropy was a test. Every species it had touched, every world it had silenced, had been asked the question. Those who had given up, who had surrendered to meaninglessness, remained in the silence. But those who had found a reason to exist, who had discovered meaning even in the face of ending, could be brought back. The entropy did not destroy meaning. It revealed whether meaning existed at all. This revelation transformed the war. The Survivors' Alliance realized that they were not fighting to destroy the entropy. They were fighting to answer its question. Every being they rescued from the silence was proof that meaning existed, that existence was worth continuing, that the universe contained something more than endless repetition. The entropy was not their enemy. It was their examiner, and they were determined to pass its test. The rescue operations accelerated. Scientists from every species developed new techniques for reaching into the silence and finding those who still held on to meaning. Philosophers and theologians and artists joined the effort, helping beings remember why they had wanted to live in the first place. As psychologists learned to heal minds that had spent centuries in the darkness, rebuilding personalities that had nearly been erased. Humanity contributed something unique to this effort. They had always been storytellers, from the first tales told around ancient campfires to the great epics that now spanned the galaxy. They knew that meaning was not found but created, not discovered but made. They taught other species how to weave stories that gave existence purpose, how to find significance in the smallest moments, how to believe in a future worth living for. 1,000 years after the first battle, the entropy began to retreat. It did not flee. It withdrew, pulling back from worlds it had claimed, releasing beings it had held. The silence that had covered a third of the galaxy slowly dissolved, revealing stars and planets that had been lost for centuries. The echoes of the taken faded, each one either rescued or finally truly gone. As the entropy retreated, it left behind a gift. In the space where it had been, woven into the fabric of reality itself, was knowledge. Everything that the creators had learned in their billions of years of existence, everything they had discovered and built and understood, all of it was encoded in the structure of the universe. The entropy had been a library as much as a test. Those who passed its examination gained access to everything that had come before. The Survivors' Alliance spent centuries absorbing this knowledge. It transformed their technology, their philosophy, their understanding of existence itself. They learned secrets that even the Watchers had never imagined, truths about the nature of reality that rewrote everything they thought they knew. That the greatest gift was not any single piece of information. It was the answer to the question the creators had asked. Yes, meaning exists. Existence is worth continuing. The universe produces beings who can find purpose, even in the face of ending. This was what the creators had wanted to know, what they had spent billions of years trying to discover. They had built the entropy to ask the question, because they themselves had forgotten the answer. Now, thanks to the Survivors' Alliance, they finally had their response. The creators did not return. They had been gone too long, vanished into whatever lay beyond existence itself. But they had left their legacy in the form of a universe that now knew something important about itself. Existence was not empty. Meaning was not an illusion. The universe was a place where beings could matter, could create, could love and hope and dream. This was not obvious. It had to be proven, and it had been proven by species who refused to surrender, by beings who chose to survive. The Survivors Alliance emerged from the war stronger than it had ever been. 100,000 species now filled the galaxy, including many that had been rescued from the silence. The entropy had withdrawn to the void between galaxies, waiting perhaps for the next civilization that would need to face its question. The worlds it had touched were healing, life returning to places that had known only emptiness for centuries. Humanity had changed during the war in ways both obvious and subtle. They had lost millions, seen worlds they had built destroyed, watched friends and family vanish into the silence. But they had also found something they had searched for throughout their entire history, a purpose that transcended survival. They were not just survivors anymore. They were teachers, showing other species how to find meaning in a universe that often seemed meaningless. They were healers, helping those rescued from the silence remember how to live. They were storytellers, weaving narratives that gave existence shape and significance. Admiral Okonkwo finally allowed himself to die 300 years after the entropy's retreat. He had been kept alive by technology for over a millennium, but he had never felt more alive than in his final days. He had seen his species face extinction and refuse it. He had fought in a war that threatened all existence and helped to win it. He had watched beings emerge from the silence, blinking in the light, remembering that they had reasons to be. His life had been meaningful, and he ended it with satisfaction. Yuki Tanaka lived for another 200 years, spending every day working to rescue those still trapped in the fading echoes of the silence. She never stopped believing that every being could be saved, that no one was truly beyond hope. When she finally passed, she had personally overseen the return of over 1 million individuals. Her name joined the list of those remembered, those whose stories gave meaning to others. The galaxy looked toward the future with a confidence it had never known before. The Watcher's predictions had been wrong. The entropy's test had been passed. Whatever came next, the Survivors Alliance would face it together. 100,000 species united by the simple truth that existence was worth fighting for. They had proven that meaning existed. Now they would spend eternity creating more of it. And somewhere, in the void between galaxies, the entropy waited. Not as an enemy, not as a threat, but as a reminder that the question would always need to be answered, that meaning had to be constantly created, that existence required effort and dedication, and hope. It would wait forever if necessary, patient and eternal, ready to pose its question whenever the universe forgot the answer. The Survivors Alliance did not intend to forget. 10,000 years had passed since a message arrived on Earth predicting humanity's extinction in 6 months. The galaxy that existed now bore little resemblance to the one that message had been sent to. Trillions of beings from 200,000 species filled space, from the core to the outer rim. Worlds that had once been barren rocks now bloomed with life. Stars that had burned alone for billions of years now hosted civilizations that spanned entire systems. The Survivors Alliance had become something beyond what any of its founders had imagined, a tapestry of existence so vast and complex that even the Watchers struggled to comprehend it all. And at the edge of the galaxy, the ship that had delivered humanity's death sentence still waited. It had been there for 20,000 years now, running on automatic, its creators long dead, its purpose long obsolete. The Survivors Alliance had debated what to do with it many times over the millennia. Some wanted to destroy it as a symbol of defiance. Others wanted to preserve it as a monument to how far they had come. In the end, they had simply left it there, a reminder of where everything had started. A young human woman named Amara Okonkwo, a descendant of the admiral who had led the fleet against the entropy 5,000 years ago, stood on the observation deck of a station orbiting Earth's sun. She was watching a ceremony taking place across the galaxy, broadcast on channels that reached every world, every ship, every being who wanted to witness it. Today was the 10,000th anniversary of the message. Today was the day the Survivors Alliance would finally respond. The response had been in preparation for centuries. Every species had contributed something: a statement, a story, a piece of art, a mathematical proof, a song. The final message was billions of terabytes of data containing everything the Survivors Alliance wanted to say to whoever or whatever might be listening. It was being transmitted from every communication device in the galaxy simultaneously, broadcast in every direction, sent toward every corner of the universe that might contain beings capable of receiving it. The content of the message was simple. It said, "We are still here." But it said much more than that, in ways that went beyond words. It contained the history of every species that had survived a Watcher prediction. It contained the stories of those who had faced the entropy and refused to surrender. It contained art that expressed what it felt like to be alive, what it meant to exist in a universe that had tried to end you. It contained music that captured the sound of 10,000 years of defiance. It contained everything that the Survivors Alliance had learned about meaning, about purpose, about hope, and it contained an invitation. The Survivors Alliance had decided that they no longer wanted to simply survive. They wanted to reach out, to find whatever else might exist in the cosmos, to make contact with beings they had never imagined. The universe was vast, far vaster than even the Watcher's ancient database could map. Somewhere out there, perhaps, were others who had faced their own tests, their own questions, their own threats of extinction. The Survivors Alliance wanted to find them. They wanted to share what they had learned. They wanted to build something that spanned not just one galaxy, but all of existence. Amara watched the message launch, watched the data streams pour out from transmission points across the galaxy, watched the light of communication speed toward destinations that would not receive it for millions of years. She felt small in that moment. One person among trillions, one life among countless billions. But she also felt connected to something vast, something that stretched back 10,000 years to her distant ancestor Marcus Williams, who had shown up for work the day after the world was supposed to end. She wondered what he would think if he could see what his species had become. Humanity had changed so much in 10,000 years that Marcus Williams would barely recognize them as the same species. They had spread to millions of worlds, their genetic code modified and adapted to environments no natural human could have survived. Some humans lived in the vacuum of space, their bodies engineered to breathe nothing at all. Others dwelt in the hearts of gas giants, their forms redesigned to withstand pressures that would crush steel. Still others existed as patterns of information, minds without bodies, thoughts without flesh. But they were still human, still stubborn, still creative, still refusing to accept any limit they could not overcome. That had not changed. That would never change. It was the core of what it meant to be human, the thing that had allowed them to survive when the Watchers had predicted their end, the thing that had carried them through the war against the entropy, the thing that defined them even when everything else had been transformed. Amara's grandmother had told her stories about the early days, tales passed down through generations, stories that had become legends. The story of Dr. Patrick Sarah Chen, who had found knowledge hidden in a message of doom. The story of the crew of the Defiance, who had travelled to dead worlds searching for answers. The story of Admiral James Okonkwo, who had led fleets against an enemy that could not be understood. The story of Yuki Tanaka, who had survived the silence and dedicated her life to bringing others back. These stories were not unique to humanity. Every species in the Survivors Alliance had their own heroes, their own legends, their own tales of impossible survival. The broken told stories of those who had dug deep underground when their world shattered, building new civilizations in the darkness. The crystalline sang songs of the Great Migration, when their entire species had travelled to a new star. The swimmers shared records of the plague years, when a disease that should have killed them all had instead been turned back by medicine that bordered on magic. Together, these stories formed a tapestry of defiance that stretched across the galaxy. Every species had faced extinction. Every species had refused it. This shared experience had bound them together more tightly than any treaty or alliance ever could. They were all survivors, all members of a club that no one had wanted to join, but everyone was proud to belong to. The ceremony continued for hours. Beings from species Amara had never seen delivered messages in languages she could not understand. Artists created works that existed for moments before dissolving into light. Musicians played instruments that had been invented on worlds so distant that their stars were not visible from Earth. Scientists announced discoveries that would reshape the understanding of physics for generations to come. Leaders made speeches about the future, about the plans that would guide the Survivors Alliance for the next 10,000 years. But the moment that Amara remembered most clearly came near the end of the ceremony, when a Watcher representative took the stage. The Watchers had changed almost as much as humanity over the past decade went a decade. Once they had been Watchers only, observers who believed they could predict the fate of all things. Now they were participants, active members of a civilization they had once thought they could only catalogue. Their ancient certainty had been replaced by something better: curiosity. They no longer believed they knew what would happen. Instead, they wondered. They asked questions. They learned. The Watcher representative was old, even by Watcher standards, one of the last who had been alive when the original message was sent to Earth. Their voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of watching, 10,000 years of being wrong, 10,000 years of learning what it meant to be surprised. They said, "When we sent our message to Earth, we believed we knew everything. We believed we had seen the rise and fall of civilization so many times that we could predict any outcome. We believed that existence was a pattern, and that once you understood the pattern, there were no more surprises. We were wrong. We have never been more happy to be wrong. The universe is not a pattern. It is a story, and stories can always take unexpected turns. Thank you, humanity, for reminding us of that. Thank you, all of you, for proving that the universe is more than we imagined. May we continue to be surprised for eternity." Amara felt tears on her face, though she could not have said exactly why she was crying. Perhaps it was the weight of history, the knowledge that she was witnessing something that would be remembered for millennia. Perhaps it was pride in her species, in all the species that had survived, in the impossible civilization they had built together. Perhaps it was simply the overwhelming nature of the moment, the sense of being part of something so much larger than herself. The ceremony ended as the last of the transmitted message left the galaxy, racing into the void toward destinations unknown. The Survivors Alliance had sent their reply to the universe. Now they would wait to see if anyone answered. Amara returned to her work the next day. She was a historian, specializing in the early period of human expansion, the centuries immediately after the Watcher's message. Her job was to preserve the stories of that time, to ensure that future generations would remember where they came from. It was not glamorous work. It did not involve commanding fleets or rescuing beings from the silence. But it was important. Someone had to remember. Her current project was a reconstruction of Marcus Williams' life, the factory worker who had shown up for his shift the day after the message. Most of what was known about him came from a single interview conducted weeks after the event, a brief recording that had survived through luck and chance. In it, Marcus explained why he had gone to work when the world was supposedly ending. "My kids still need to eat," he had said. "Aliens or no aliens, that doesn't change. If the world ends tomorrow, I'll deal with it tomorrow. Today, I've got a job to do." It was such a simple statement, so ordinary in its concerns. But Amara had come to believe that it contained something profound. The power of survival did not come from grand gestures or heroic speeches. It came from the small decisions. The choice to keep going when giving up seemed reasonable. The refusal to stop living just because death might be near. Marcus Williams had not saved humanity by going to work that day, but he had embodied the spirit that would eventually save them. He had shown what it looked like to refuse to quit. 500 years after the 10,000th anniversary, something extraordinary happened. A response came. It arrived not through any known form of communication, but through a phenomenon that no scientist in the Survivors Alliance could explain. Across the entire galaxy, simultaneously, beings began to dream the same dream. A message delivered not through technology, but through the fabric of reality itself, reaching every mind capable of receiving it. The message was from beyond the known universe, from spaces so distant that light from the galactic core would take longer to reach them than the age of the universe itself. It came from beings so different from anything the Survivors Alliance had ever encountered that calling them life seemed like a category error. They existed in ways that defied conventional understanding, in dimensions that the Survivors Alliance had not known existed. These beings had received the message sent during the anniversary ceremony. It had taken 500 years to reach them, travelling through spaces that were not quite space, following paths that did not quite exist. They had understood it, somehow, had decoded its meaning, despite possessing no common frame of reference with its senders, and they had chosen to respond. Their message was difficult to interpret, filtered through dreams and translated by minds that had never evolved to comprehend such communication. But the core of it was clear. They were not alone. Neither was the Survivors Alliance. The universe was full of existence, full of beings who had faced their own tests and survived, full of civilizations that had found their own meanings. The cosmos was not empty. It was abundant, beyond imagining. And the beings beyond the universe had a proposal. They wanted to meet. They wanted to share what they had learned, to receive what the Survivors Alliance could offer, to build connections across distances that had once seemed absolute. They were extending an invitation, just as the Survivors Alliance had extended one. The circle was completing itself. The journey would take thousands of years. It would require technologies that did not yet exist, methods of travel that had only been theorized, cooperation between species on a scale that had never been attempted. But the Survivors Alliance had time. They had resources. Most importantly, they had the will. They had spent 10,000 years proving that they could survive anything. Now they would prove that they could do more than survive. They could reach. Amara did not live to see the journey begin. Neither did her children or her grandchildren or their descendants for many generations. But she knew it would happen. She had studied enough history to know that when beings decided to do the impossible, they usually found a way. The journey beyond the universe would happen because it had to happen, because the Survivors Alliance was not the kind of civilization that turned back from a challenge. She died at peace, surrounded by family, her work complete. The story she had collected and preserved would live on, passed down through centuries, teaching new generations where they came from and what they had overcome. Her name would not be remembered the way the heroes of legend were remembered. She had not commanded fleets or saved worlds or faced down cosmic threats. She had simply done her job, day after day, preserving the past so that the future would have roots. In this, she was like Marcus Williams. In this, she was like trillions of others who had lived and died and been forgotten, whose contributions were too small to record but too important to ignore. The Survivors Alliance was not built by heroes alone. It was built by everyone who had ever chosen to keep going when stopping would have been easier. It was built by factory workers and historians, by parents and children, by beings who had never done anything remarkable except refuse to give up. The journey beyond the universe began 3,000 years after Amara's death. The ships that made the voyage were larger than planets, carrying millions of beings from thousands of species. They travelled through dimensions that had no names, following paths that the beings beyond had shown them in dreams. It took 4,000 years to arrive, generations born and dying in transit, entire civilizations rising and falling within the ships themselves. What they found when they arrived was beyond description. The beings beyond were not physical. They were not energy. They were something else entirely. Patterns of meaning that existed independent of any substrate, thoughts without thinkers, ideas without minds. They had evolved, if that was the right word, in the spaces between universes, in the quantum foam that underlied all existence. They had watched universes be born and die. They had seen civilizations rise and fall on scales that made the watchers' observations seem like the work of children. And they were delighted to meet the Survivors Alliance. The meeting lasted for centuries. Both sides had so much to share, so much to learn, so much to discover. the beings beyond shared knowledge that rewrote the fundamental understanding of reality. The Survivors Alliance shared something the beings beyond had never encountered: physicality, the experience of having a body, of touching and tasting and feeling, of existing in a specific place at a specific time. It was, to the beings beyond, a revelation. Trade agreements were established. Cultural exchanges began. Beings from the Survivors Alliance learned to project themselves into the spaces beyond the universe, experiencing existence in ways that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. Beings beyond learned to manifest in physical reality, to take forms that could interact with matter, to experience the peculiar joy of having a body. The universe, it turned out, was not all there was. It was not even most of what there was. Reality extended in directions that physical beings had never imagined, containing forms of existence that defied categorization. The Survivors Alliance had reached beyond their own cosmos, and found that the cosmos itself was just one small part of something incomprehensibly larger. And everywhere they looked, they found the same truth they had discovered in their own galaxy. Existence was full. The void was not empty. The darkness was not silent. Everywhere beings had arisen, faced challenges, survived or perished, found meaning or lost it. The struggle that the Survivors Alliance had experienced was not unique, it was universal. It was the fundamental nature of existence itself, the constant process of finding reasons to continue. The beings beyond had their own version of the Watchers, entities that had observed their realm for eons beyond counting. They had their own version of the entropy, tests that sorted the meaningful from the meaningless. They had their own stories of survival, their own heroes, their own legends. And they wanted to hear the stories of the Survivors Alliance, wanted to understand how physical beings had overcome challenges that the beings beyond had faced in their own way. The Survivors Alliance told them everything. The message from the Watchers, the 6 months that had stretched into 10,000 years, the war against the entropy, the rescue operations that had pulled beings back from the silence. The anniversary ceremony and the response it had brought, every story, every legend, every small moment of defiance that had added up to the impossible civilization they had become. The beings beyond listened with something that might have been wonder, if wonder could exist in entities that had seen universes born. They had encountered many forms of survival, many expressions of meaning. But physical beings were rare, and those who had survived as long as the Survivors Alliance were rarer still. The universe that had given birth to humanity, to the Watchers, to all the species of the Alliance, was special. Not unique, perhaps, but special. And the beings beyond offered a gift. They had the power to reach back through time, not to change events, but to observe them. They offered to show the Survivors Alliance the moment it all began, the actual moment when the Watchers' message arrived on Earth, the moment when humanity first learned of its predicted extinction. They wanted to see how it had really happened, how the spark of defiance had first been struck. The offer was accepted, and so, 15,000 years after the message arrived, delegates from the Survivors Alliance witnessed it again. They watched as the signal came in, broadcast on every frequency. They watched as the world went mad, as governments scrambled and religions pronounced and scientists debated. They watched the 3 days of chaos that had followed, and they watched Marcus Williams show up for his shift at the factory. He looked so ordinary, so unremarkable. A man in work clothes, tired from a night of little sleep, worried about his children and his bills and his life. He did not know that he was making history. He did not know that his simple choice to keep going would echo through millennia. He was just a man going to work because his family needed him to. That was the moment. That was when it all started. Not with grand speeches or heroic stands, but with a factory worker who refused to let the end of the world stop him from doing his job. The Survivors Alliance watched him walk through the factory doors, and they understood something that perhaps they had always known, but had never seen so clearly. Survival was not about being special. It was about being ordinary in extraordinary circumstances. It was about doing what needed to be done even when everything seemed hopeless. It was about showing up, day after day, refusing to let despair win. Marcus Williams had shown up. his children had shown up, their children had shown up, and their descendants had shown up for 10,000 years, building a civilization that stretched across the galaxy and beyond. The beings beyond were moved, in their strange way, by this vision. They had seen many forms of heroism across their eternal existence. But this was something different. This was heroism without glory, without recognition, without any expectation of reward. This was the heroism of ordinary beings doing ordinary things, because they mattered, because existence was worth fighting for, because giving up was simply not an option. The delegation returned to their present, carrying with them the memory of that moment. They shared it with everyone who wanted to see, a gift to the entire Survivors Alliance. Here was where they came from. Here was how it started. Here was the truth of their existence. They were all descendants of beings who had refused to quit. The story did not end there. Stories never really end. The Survivors Alliance continued to grow, continued to explore, continued to find new forms of existence beyond what anyone had imagined. The universe continued to surprise them, to challenge them, to offer them problems that seemed impossible and solutions that seemed miraculous. They met more beings from beyond reality, formed alliances with entities that existed in dimensions humans could not perceive, built connections that spanned spaces that had no names, and they never forgot where they came from. On Earth, preserved exactly as it had been, stood the factory where Marcus Williams had worked. It had become a sacred site, visited by billions of beings from across the cosmos, a reminder that small acts of defiance could change the universe. The message from the Watchers was displayed there, translated into every language that had ever been spoken. Estimated time until extinction, 6 standard galactic months. Beneath it was inscribed a response that had taken 10,000 years to write. You were wrong. We survived. We grew. We reached beyond everything you could imagine. And we are still here, still working, still refusing to quit. We will be here for eternity, and longer if eternity ends. This is not because we are special. It is because we show up. Day after day, generation after generation, we show up. That is what it means to be a survivor. That is what it means to find meaning. That is what it means to be alive. The message that had predicted humanity's end in 6 months had become the beginning of everything. And everything, it turned out, was just the start. The universe was vast. Existence was infinite. There would always be more challenges, more tests, more questions to answer. But the Survivors Alliance would face them all, together, united by the simple truth that had carried them through 10,000 years of impossible survival. We are still here. And we always will be.